Day 5. Being diplomatic is often a study in the art of subtlety. Now, subtle is a word with many subtle meanings. A diplomat would probably like the definitions that tend towards clever, ingenious, and cunning. On Saturday, October 20th, 1962, two master diplomats on opposite sides, U.S. President John F. Kennedy and Foreign Minister of the USSR Andrei Gromyko, will use another definition of the word, so delicate or so precise as to be difficult to analyze or describe. I'm Indy Neidell. This is TimeGhost with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Yesterday, the 19th, the first Soviet nuclear warheads had been made ready for deployment on Cuba. At the same time, the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff had presented the president with their preferred plans for a military solution to the crisis. Kennedy had left the meeting with the impression that he had made clear that he wanted to explore diplomacy and maybe a blockade. The chiefs had understood him differently. Kennedy is in Ohio campaigning for Democratic candidates for the upcoming midterm elections. Despite the crisis, he will go ahead with his pre-existing schedule to not raise public alarm. The campaign speeches he holds focus on everything except foreign affairs and the looming nuclear crisis. Meanwhile, Gromyko, who is still in the States, is cabling Moscow his conclusions from meetings with Kennedy and Secretary of State Rusk 2 days ago. Gromyko has spent many years in the U.S., speaks fluent English, has a degree in American economics. Nonetheless, he's a passionate and convinced communist. He's also a hard-ass negotiator that patiently listens but stands his ground without budging an inch or displaying emotion. He has a photographic memory and a razor-sharp mind. In short, he understands his adversary, is experienced, and is smart enough to read the tea leaves. He reports that in his meetings with Kennedy and Rusk, he made a point of protesting the embargo on Cuba, which he calls a blockade and piracy. He's gotten concessions on Laos and steered the conversation to Berlin to keep Kennedy focused on that conflict instead of Cuba. During those meetings, no one mentions the missiles outright. Instead, they use the euphemism events in July. Gromyko is adamant that an invasion of Cuba is unacceptable. He writes that Kennedy replies, "As president, I am trying to restrain those people in the U.S. who are favoring invasion to Cuba." Referring to the events in July, he notes the president's words, "I repeat, a very dangerous situation arose regarding this issue, and I don't know what can be the outcome." One would assume that he understood the point, especially since he ends his report by noting that the Americans are deeply perturbed. By Rusk's behavior, it was possible to observe how painfully the American leaders are suffering the fact that the Soviet Union decisively has stood on the side of Cuba and that the Cubans are conducting themselves bravely and confidently. Kennedy managed to hide his feelings better, but he too, when he spoke about Cuba, formulated his ideas with emphasis, slowly, obviously weighing every word. It is characteristic that Rusk, during our entire conversation with Kennedy, sat absolutely silently and read like a crab. In the conversation with him later, he couldn't hide his feelings very well. No matter what Gromyko personally thinks, in Moscow, the rest of the Soviets now believe that the trick has worked. Their assessment is that the Americans are now deterred from hostile actions against Cuba. This is supported by reports by the Polish ambassador to the U.S. and other intelligence. They are right about Kennedy being both against an invasion of Cuba and opposed to a nuclear war. In fact, Kennedy is extremely aware of the grave responsibility weighing on his shoulders. Sometime before the crisis, he had read the book The Guns of August by Barbara Tuchman, outlining how World War I erupted by mistake through actions and inactions by the leadership of the European powers. Now, I could say a lot to the accuracy or inaccuracy of Mrs. Tuchman's assessment, but as you know, you can learn more about that on my YouTube channel, The Great War. In any case, during the whole crisis, the president will keep a copy of this book on his desk. He tells his brother in private that he does so to remind himself of his fear that someone might one day write a book called The Missiles of October because of him. But the Russians are wrong about the Americans being deterred. Instead, they've poked the bear and given those in favor of an invasion fuel for their fire. Bobby Kennedy was even part of that group at least 4 days ago at the beginning of the crisis. And remember, the president had met the Joint Chiefs and walked away with the impression that they had understood his message of restraint. Remember, too, that they had chosen to understand his message differently from what he thought. Anyway, on this morning, the 34th President of the United States is about to change his mind. From his statement of being ready to do nothing at all about the missiles on Cuba, he will now move to side more with the hawks, advising a forceful response. The day starts off fairly normally at the Blackstone Hotel in Chicago with the usual briefings, breakfast, and preparations for the campaign events of the day. All of this is interrupted when Robert Kennedy calls at 10 a.m. and informs his brother that the ExComm members are now urgently asking to meet the president and are ready to decide on a response. ExComm is the group dealing with the crisis. More intelligence has become available and the situation is worse than they thought. The CIA has a new assessment of the total strength of Soviet forces on Cuba, though they still hugely underestimate the number of Russian troops present as between 6,000 and 8,000, instead of the actual 45,000. But they have discovered all 40 of the MiG-21 fighter and the Ilyushin-28 mid-range strategic bombers, most of which are still in crates awaiting assembly. They have discovered 15 Komar-class speedboats armed with 2 tactical nuclear missiles each, which is 3 more than the actual 12 boats that are there on Cuba. And most of the SAM sites and almost all of the missile sites are also now known. Moreover, today, for the first time, there is mention of possible tactical nuclear Frog missiles in their report, but they note this as unsubstantiated rumor. They still don't know where the strategic nuclear warheads are stored. They're not even sure that they're on the island yet, so they have not noticed that the first ones are in fact ready to be locked and loaded since yesterday. Even if they underestimate their opponent's strength, the U.S. now knows that it would face a substantial Soviet force armed with tactical nuclear arms if they invade Cuba. But remarkably, the CIA still think that the Soviets would probably not go to war with the U.S., not even on Cuba itself, if they did invade. Instead, they argue that the USSR will stay out of it and choose to heat up conflicts in other locations as a response. They come up with some fairly vague reasons for this thinking. One of them is a judicial argument stating that there's no public and official military alliance between Cuba and the Soviet Union, making a war on Cuba involving the Soviet Union technically illegal. They failed to furnish any argument to show the legality of the U.S. waging war on Cuba, though, which will prove significant later in the day. Be that as it may, there is alarm that the Soviets might get even stronger if action is not initiated immediately. JFK agrees with RFK, that's Bobby, and ExComm's assessment, and it's decided that the president will return to Washington immediately. Now, in order to not alarm the public, he consults with his personal physician, and they concoct a story about a sudden bout of the flu. Press statements are drawn up and sent out within minutes. There's even an improvised photo op as the president leaves the hotel, doing his best to look ill. By 1:30, he's back in Washington and on his way to the 505th meeting of the National Security Council. As it's an official NSC meeting, it's not recorded. The meeting will last for 5 hours, and the discussions will get tough, even uncivil. It opens with a briefing on the situation. The official minutes note Kennedy's reaction. There is something to destroy in Cuba now, and if it is destroyed, a strategic missile capability would be difficult to restore. Defense Secretary McNamara acknowledges that they have not been able to agree on one course of action to recommend, so they present the president with 2 alternatives: the blockade track, led by McNamara, and the Bundy Plan, or the airstrike route, led by Chairman of the Joint Chiefs General Taylor and National Security Advisor Bundy. 3 remarkable things emerge from the record of that meeting. 1. President Kennedy expresses his principal opposition to an invasion of Cuba, while still explicitly directing the Joint Chiefs to begin the plans for such an invasion. CIA Director McComb writes in his notes tomorrow that an invasion of Cuba was agreed upon when all other actions had run their course. 2. It's clear that the participants are anticipating a war that could go much further than Cuba and could become a nuclear confrontation. They discuss limiting this risk by dismantling warheads in Turkey and Italy so that they don't fire these off even if they are attacked by the Russians. They decide to reconsider their opposition to French nuclear armament and help France with its nuclear development. Bobby Kennedy even proposes giving nuclear arms to West Germany, or at least threatening the Soviets that they will. 3. Legality, or the appearance of legality, is a major concern that helps decide the course of action. In the end, the Bundy plan is rejected partly because the U.S. would look like the bad guy through a sudden, unannounced attack. Bobby Kennedy calls it the Pearl Harbor effect. Even wording becomes an issue so that when they choose the blockade track, they decide to call it quarantine, as blockade would imply an act of war. Only one member of the meeting speaks up in opposition of decisive action. It's once again the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Adlai Stevenson. He suggests negotiating a trade with the Soviets, offer to withdraw missiles from Turkey and Italy, give up foreign military bases, and offer closing the Guantanamo military base on Cuba. The whole meeting jumps on him one after another. Even the president is noted as, quote, forcefully rejecting the Guantanamo idea. Security advisor and Stevenson's friend, George W. Ball, who was present, will say that members intemperately upbraided Stevenson and were outraged and shrill. Stevenson himself remarks, "I know that most of those fellows will consider me a coward for the rest of my life for what I said today. But perhaps we need a coward in the room when we're talking about nuclear war." Finally, the blockade, or quarantine, is decided on to begin Monday, and the preparations go ahead for how to inform U.S. lawmakers, foreign allies, and the public. The current military exercise on Vieques to take out the imaginary dictator Ortsak, Castro spelled backwards, is immediately suspended, and the forces involved are held in readiness for a possible invasion. According to men who are on the ships involved in the exercise, to their shock, they are now informed over the ship's loudspeakers that they will be redirected towards Cuba. And U.S. Army, Navy, and Air Force bases around the world, hundreds of thousands of men and women are now made ready for what their commander-in-chief believes could be a third world war that might erupt as soon as this coming Monday. See you on day 6, when the preparations for quarantine and war continue. If you're just joining us, you can find the first episode, day 0, right here. Don't forget to subscribe, and please support us on Patreon so that we can make more awesome history. Good night and good luck.